Good day, gentlemen. Dirk here with the MGTOW solution. If you're a man living in the modern world, then you have to be aware of the terms misogyny and misandry. But let's review the definitions by Webster, who puts it very simply. Misogyny, a hatred of women. Misandry, a hatred of men. So they're basically the same thing, applied to different genders. We hear about misogyny every time a feminist gets called out for being wrong about something. It's like a reflex. If you say anything negative about women, you're labeled a misogynist. It's the same tactic used by any group that wants to promote itself as oppressed. If you don't agree with me, then there's something obviously wrong with you and you're a bad person. The assumption is made by the accuser that they can somehow sense what another person is thinking, and so can know their underlying motivation. So they attempt to assign a label to you to discredit anything you have to say. For example, I'm MGTOW, and that alone is enough to get me branded a misogynist, even though by definition I'm not. I don't have an irrational hatred of women. There are plenty of women I have respect for and even admire. Lindsey Vonn, the Olympic skier, for example. She's an outstanding athlete, and I always give credit where credit is due. Lynn Hill, the legendary climber, is another. I have no idea what kind of woman she is, but as a climber, she's world class by any standard, and I respect that. At the same time, there are also a lot of women out there I have zero respect for. But then I could say the same thing about men. Pedophiles and thieves, for example. I also don't like backstabbing men, lazy men, or dishonest men. Some men are just assholes. Saying that doesn't make me a misandrist any more than voting against Hillary made me a misogynist. Some women are scumbags. Some men are scumbags. But you can make some generalizations. For example, women tend to be hypergamous, and men often have a tendency to think with their cocks, at least when they're young. Could anyone honestly deny those facts? Probably not. But regarding the men, I'd have to argue that, and forgive me here, not all men are like that. Especially not MGTOW, who have actually learned to think with their brains. Because we've studied the issues and learned from direct experience, we can apply our intellect instead of acting on our primal instincts. Which brings us to one of the fundamental differences between the sexes. Men are driven by logic, and women are driven by emotion. When a man examines female behavior and consistently observes things like selfishness, materialism, vanity, laziness, and the like, he's gathering information in order to form an opinion based upon observable facts. If he comes to the conclusion that women generally don't have all that much to offer, that's not an unfounded hatred of women, it's a logical deduction. If you ask any MGTOW why he feels the way he does about women, you might want to pull up a chair, because he'll probably be able to go on for hours, citing evidence to support his conclusions. By contrast, women tend to stick with simple emotional statements like, men are pigs, and leave it at that. Ask them to elaborate, and they'll probably resort to more character attacks, delivered with much drama and emphasis, but no logic whatsoever. I know this because I've seen it, over and over again. When you push most women for a logical argument, they usually just get more agitated by their own inability to argue with facts. It's like having a battle of wits with an unarmed opponent. Misandry is a term we don't hear all that much because it has a negative connotation to it that reflects poorly on women. However, the term misogyny only reflects poorly on men, so it's an acceptable term to use, and we hear it all the time. You may be asking yourself, but Dirk, why should we give a fuck? Well, because at some point, as MGTOW, you'll probably be called a misogynist, among other things. And even if you don't give a fuck about that, consider this. A quick Google search for misogyny turned up 5,410,000 results, while misandry only turned up 928,000. I interpret that to mean that people are almost 6 times more interested in labeling men with derogatory terms than they are in labeling women. I could be wrong here, but that 6-to-1 ratio sounds about right, and it's consistent with many of the other stats we have about men and women, like fatality rates and prison sentences. You won't hear about those things outside of our community, but again, being men means we can apply our intellect to understand what's really going on here based upon facts rather than emotions. So we can add these terms to the lengthy list of double standards. If you're a woman speaking out against men, you won't be labeled a misandrist. You'll be held up as a champion of civil rights and equality. But if you're a man speaking out against women, well, you're obviously a misogynist. Speaking of double standards, here's an example of misandry being acceptable where misogyny clearly isn't. In our society, men getting kicked in the balls is often considered hilarious. And you know I'm right. You see it in movies all the time. It seems to me that if you take pleasure in seeing this, you're exhibiting some misandry. But what you don't see are women getting kicked in the sacred vagina. This is because female suffering isn't even considered acceptable, let alone funny. That would be misogynistic. Also at the movies, when a man gets killed, it's often a very graphic, gruesome death. They'll show every gory detail of a man getting his head blown off, or getting impaled on a sharp object, or getting torn apart by some creature. And they very often emphasize the man suffering. But this isn't acceptable because the character is a bad guy. It's acceptable because the character is a man. Women also die in movies, but it's usually implied instead of actually shown. And in any case, it's usually portrayed as some kind of terrible tragedy, where the world is suffering a great loss. There are exceptions to this, but it does seem to be a rule of thumb for movie makers. This all goes back to the idea that women are more valuable than men. Therefore, our purpose in life is to serve as disposable utilities, and if we refuse, we're not real men. We're supposed to accept our fate, man up, and do as we're told. After all, most men do exactly that. It's the accepted blue pill norm. Only a deranged man would reject this, because it's the natural order of things, right? This is why feminists hate MGTOW, MRAs, and anyone else who refuses to acknowledge that women are superior. They actually think we're delusional and out of touch with reality because their perceived reality is the only one they can see, and they can't imagine anyone not thinking the same way. Feminism is embraced like religion in many cases, and for these women, all men are nothing less than infidels. I realize that we're just talking semantics here, but in the war of ideas, words matter. And if there's one thing you can never have too much of, it's knowledge. That's what the MGTOW community is all about, picking up ideas here and there until you have enough knowledge to navigate the treacherous waters of the feminocracy with complete confidence. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.